There's this funny thing that happens when women age. We become damn near invisible.
Oh, dear.
Oh, I got you.
I can't thank you enough. May I offer you one of these?
Oh, my grandma loves these.
It's biological. We turn 65, we start buying them. The 21st floor, please.
It's useful because nobody sees us coming.
What we just watched is a masterclass in invisibility. Madeleine Matty Matlock, played by Kathy Bates, isn't dismissed with scorn. She's treated with sympathy, seen as too gentle, too fragile, too harmless to pose a threat. They lowered their guard around her, never guessing that's exactly what she wants, because while they indulge her, she's quietly piecing together the truth right under their noses. That's fiction, but it speaks to a very real question. In May 2007, in Praia da Luz, Portugal, Madeleine McCann disappeared, and when the world talks about that case, we remember Kate and Jerry McCann. We remember their friends, the group the press called the Tapas 7. But there was someone else at that table, someone who, over time, has become almost invisible in the story. Fiona Payne's mother, Diane Webster. She was rarely mentioned, rarely analysed, something of an outsider in the group, a late addition to the holiday. Even in the police interviews, she sometimes seemed vague, forgetful, and so, in the public memory, she faded away, treated almost like a background character to the tragedy. One commentator described her perfectly. John Blacksmith, reviewing Kate McCann's book Madeleine, wrote that Diane was like the stage comedy scatty old lady who can't even remember her own address and isn't old at all, veering wildly between genuine forgetfulness and a sharp suspicion that the less she says about anything, the better for everybody. Dismissive words, perhaps, but they raise a bigger question. What if Diane Webster, like Matty Matlock, knew more than people assumed? What if her quiet testimony, buried in the case files, contains details that slipped past everyone else's radar? Now let's revisit Diane Webster's official statements, line by line, not to sensationalize, but to listen, because sometimes the voices we overlook are the ones that matter most. When people think of the Madeleine McCann case, certain names immediately come to mind. Kate and Jerry McCann, their friends, the group the media labelled the Tapas 7. Over the years, their statements, their actions, their contradictions have been dissected in endless detail. But what's striking is who gets remembered and who fades into the background, because there was someone else at that table, someone technically part of the Tapas 7, yet rarely spoken of in the same breath. A figure so quiet, so understated that her presence is almost forgotten in the retelling of this story. Her name? Diane Webster. Diane was Fiona Payne's mother, a grandmother. She joined the trip to Portugal not as a central organizer, not as part of the group's long-established circle of friendships, but simply as family, there to spend time with her daughter and grandchildren. She wasn't the face of the story splashed across headlines. She wasn't the focus of speculation. She wasn't pursued by journalists on her return to Britain. And yet, she was there, in Praia da Luz, at the tapas dinners, on the very night Madeleine vanished. Her husband had also been invited to the holiday, but he declined. Diane decided to come on her own. In that choice lies an important truth. She was a late addition to the holiday. She wasn't part of the tight-knit core of friends who had planned the trip together. She didn't share in the years of previous vacations, nor the familiar rituals that bound them together. She arrived almost as an afterthought, a supporting role to her daughter's family. This difference shaped how others saw her. Russell O'Brien, one of the Tapas 7, described it plainly in his later interview with police. He said, "Diane Webster is Fiona's mother. We obviously met her through Fiona and Dave. We'd been friends with them for some time, meeting at their house, going out on their boat. I'd say we knew Diane quite well." It's a telling statement. Russell acknowledges familiarity, but there's no intimacy. She was known through Fiona and Dave Payne, not on her own terms. In other words, Diane Webster was always someone's mother, someone's guest, never the core friend, never the insider. And that difference, her position at the edge of the group, is what makes her testimony so fascinating today. John Blacksmith, a commentator on the case, would later describe Diane as an ephemeral figure, someone it was difficult to get any insight into. Even Kate McCann's own book, Madeleine, barely gave readers a sense of who she was. To some observers, she seemed like a stage comedy character, the scatty older lady, forgetful, vague, unsure of details. And yet, others noticed something sharper beneath the surface, a suspicion that perhaps Diane Webster knew more than she let on, and that her vagueness was, in itself, deliberate. So who was Diane Webster? On one level, she was the grandmother who volunteered for sandwiches, who took care of her grandchildren during naps, who joined tennis lessons on sunny mornings. But on another level, she was the quiet witness at the edge of one of the most scrutinized crime scenes of the 21st century. She was there when the alarm was raised. She gave testimony that, while often overlooked, contains some of the most unsettling details in the entire case. She was both an insider and an outsider, present yet forgotten, a witness who slipped beneath the radar while others absorbed the spotlight. And as we revisit her testimony, we're forced to ask, was a Diane Webster simply a bystander in this story? Or was she, in her silence, carrying pieces of the truth no one thought to notice? Diane Webster's time in Praia da Luz followed its own rhythm. Unlike the rest of the group, who often acted in unison, breakfasting together, taking part in activities as a unit, Diane hovered on the edge, creating her own small routine within the larger holiday. Most mornings began the same way. Around 8 o'clock, she would have breakfast alone in her apartment. The rest of the group, including her daughter Fiona, gathered at the Millennium restaurant on the resort grounds. Only once, on a rainy Wednesday, did Diane deviate from her solitude to join them. It was a small detail, but one that reflects the way she often orbited the group without fully merging into it. Despite this independence, Diane wasn't completely detached. She signed herself up for tennis lessons, along with Kate McCann and Jane Tanner. Her chosen slot ran from 9 to 10 in the morning. Afterward, she would return to her apartment to shower. Some mornings, she stopped at the Batista supermarket for groceries. Other times, she simply sat out on her veranda, read a book, or took the chance to sunbathe by the pool. These were quiet hours, with Diane's presence marked more by routine than by socializing. Midday brought the group together again. Lunch was usually taken at the Payne's apartment, larger and more accommodating than the others. Diane often volunteered to help, shopping for supplies, or preparing sandwiches. In her less derogatory interview, she put it simply, "I used to volunteer. I wasn't expected to, but I helped with the food." But she admitted it wasn't every day. The McCanns, interestingly, were often absent from these lunches, choosing to make their own arrangements. It was another reminder that, even within this seemingly tight circle, small differences in routine were common. Afternoons followed a similar pattern. The Payne children rarely attended the afternoon creche, so Diane sometimes looked after them while Fiona and David joined the others for leisure, tennis, the beach, or the pool. In her statement to Portuguese police, Diane explained that after lunch, the children usually napped in her care. While the parents enjoyed their holiday activities, she remained behind in the apartment. At other times, she read, went shopping, or simply rested. For her, afternoons were less about activity and more about keeping the home space running smoothly. By 5 o'clock, the creches emptied. Staff led the children in single file to the Tapas bar, holding onto a long rope called Sammy Snake. There, the children were reunited with their parents and served their evening meal, known as high tea. Diane was a regular presence at these gatherings, sitting with Fiona and the group as the children ate. By 6:30, she usually returned to the apartment, helping with the bedtime routine. The children were typically asleep by 7 or past. Then the adults began preparing for their own evening ritual. At 8:30 each night, the group met at the Tapas restaurant for dinner. A table had been pre-booked for the week. For hours, they sat, ate, and drank, with parents leaving intermittently to check on their children. But Diane Webster made one detail crystal clear in her police testimony. She never once took part in those nighttime checks. She believed each parent only ever checked on their own children, and that was how the system worked. She, the grandmother, was not involved. It may seem a small point, but it carries weight. While others later debated who checked on whom and when, Diane remained outside that chain of responsibility. Her testimony set her apart, again, as both part of the group and somehow removed from its inner workings, present at every stage of the day, yet never at the center of events. The grandmother in the background, watching quietly, living her own version of the holiday alongside everyone else. Wednesday, the 2nd of May, 2007, the day before Madeleine McCann vanished, investigators needed to reconstruct every detail of the group's week, the routines, the weather, the mood. For Diane Webster, this day stood out for one reason above all else. She remembered it being rainy. Normally, Diane ate breakfast alone in her apartment, but on that morning, because of the weather, she joined the others at the Millennium restaurant. It was the only time all week that she did. Beyond that, her recollections were hazy. She admitted to police that she couldn't clearly recall what else she did that day. A fragment of weather, a meal, but a little more. This might sound trivial, but in this case, the memory of rain on May 2nd became significant because it was used to separate the timelines of the week. Diane's recollection matched local weather data. May 2nd was indeed cloudy and wet, while the following day, May 3rd, the day Madeleine disappeared, was bright and sunny. That distinction matters because of one photograph, the so-called last photo of Madeleine. It shows Jerry McCann sitting by the children's pool with Madeleine and her siblings. Jerry said it was taken by Kate around 2:29 in the afternoon of May 3rd, but when the picture was first released, some questioned whether it had actually been taken earlier in the week. Critics argued that the sunny scene didn't match what they believed was the weather on May 3rd. Diane's memory of the rain on Wednesday, however, supports the official record. May 2nd was a rainy day. May 3rd was a sunny day, which means the photograph, controversial as it became, was consistent with the conditions Jerry described. Still, Diane's testimony for that day was marked by vagueness. She offered no polished account, no timeline rich with detail. She gave investigators the fragments she remembered and admitted the rest was unclear. To some, this confirmed the image of her as forgetful, the grandmother whose memory couldn't be trusted. But there's another way of looking at it. In a case where so many witnesses offered precise stories days or even weeks later, Diane's willingness to say, "I don't remember," might be the most honest answer of all. Thursday, May 3rd, 2007, the day Madeleine McCann disappeared. For investigators, reconstructing this day hour by hour was essential. And while Diane Webster wasn't the central figure in the group, her testimony still offers a quiet but valuable thread in the timeline. That morning, Diane kept to her familiar routine. She attended her tennis lesson from 9 until 10 o'clock. Afterwards, she returned to her apartment, showered, and, as she told police, spent some time shopping for groceries at the Batista supermarket. The rest of the late morning she described as relaxed, time spent in her apartment or nearby, without anything unusual to note. In the afternoon, Diane sometimes shouldered the duties of a grandmother. On this day, she recalled looking after the Payne children for a time, while Fiona and David joined the others in leisure activities. The children napped, and Diane remained in the apartment, reading and resting. It was a typical day, ordinary in every respect, until the evening. Dinner that night at the Tapas restaurant was set, as always, for 8:30, but Diane and the Paynes were late. As they approached, she remembered running into Matthew Oldfield. He was on his way to check on his children in the apartment. Matthew teased them for being late, joking about it before heading off. It was a passing moment, but one of those small details investigators later used to anchor the timeline of who was where and when. When Diane finally sat down, she paid attention to who was at the table and who wasn't. She described the group's seating arrangements, the flow of people coming and going. Not everyone was there all the time. She recalled that Jane Tanner and Russell O'Brien were absent for part of the evening. Their child had been ill, and Russell spent long stretches in the apartment. Jane moved back and forth between dinner and her daughter's bedside. To Diane, these comings and goings didn't seem unusual. They were part of the rhythm of the group's nights, parents balancing dinner with childcare. But in hindsight, those very movements became central to the timeline of Madeleine's disappearance. Who left the table? At what time? For how long? Diane's quiet observations about lateness, about who was missing, became another piece in a complicated puzzle. For much of the evening, Diane stayed in her seat. She didn't take part in the checking system, didn't leave the restaurant to look in on sleeping children. That was for the parents to manage. Her role was as an observer, watching, listening, noting who was present, who was not. And though she didn't realize it at the time, that ordinary dinner at the Tapas bar would soon become one of the most scrutinized meals in modern history. Around 10 o'clock that night, the Tapas bar erupted into chaos. Kate McCann had gone back to the apartment to check on her children and returned screaming. Madeleine was gone. For Diane Webster, the moment was a blur of panic. She followed the others as they rushed to apartment 5A. Inside, she saw Jerry McCann in visible distress. She described him as almost collapsing, devastated by what Kate had found. Kate, meanwhile, was frantic, searching every corner, shouting her daughter's name. Diane tried to help, but her role was uncertain. She looked around the apartment, but admitted later that she didn't know where to go or what to look for. She recalled standing on the veranda, sitting helplessly as the night unfolded in confusion around her. The searchers spilled outside, into the streets, the nearby resort grounds. But Diane was honest about her limitations. She said she didn't know where to search or even how. She wasn't the one running through the darkness. She wasn't the one leading others. She was once again on the edge of the action. And yet, one detail from Diane Webster's testimony has lingered in investigators' minds, a detail that makes her account stand out. She remembered seeing the twins, Sean and Amelie, still in their beds in apartment 5A. What shocked her was how deeply they slept. Amid the commotion, the shouting, the searching, the raised voices, the twins did not stir, not once. Diane later remarked that their unresponsiveness was so unusual it led her to wonder if they had been sedated. It was a chilling observation. None of the others in their testimonies focused on that detail, but Diane did. She was the one who voiced suspicion over how unnaturally heavy the twins' sleep seemed that night. A grandmother's perspective, noticing something about children that others either missed or chose not to emphasize. Of course, sedation was never proven. Was it a cover-up or just a mere observation from an old lady and the authorities seemed to dismiss it? But the fact that Diane Webster raised it at all shows how unsettled she was by what she saw. It remains one of the most striking and haunting parts of her testimony. A single moment of perception, lodged in the middle of the storm, that still echoes years later. As the night stretched on, Diane drifted back and forth between the Tapas bar and the apartments. She recalled feeling useless, powerless. Eventually, she sat in silence on the veranda, watching the chaos unfold, while others scoured the resort. Later, the twins were moved into her apartment for safety. By then, Praia da Luz had become a crime scene, swarming with police, neighbors, and volunteers. But for Diane, the memory that stayed was not the search nor the shouting. It was the silence of the twins, asleep through it all, as if untouched by the disaster that had just changed everything. In the hours after the alarm, chaos spread through the Ocean Club. Parents, staff, and holiday makers poured into the night, combing the resort for signs of a missing child. But Diane Webster's movements during this time paint a different picture, one of uncertainty, of helplessness, of a woman caught in the middle of a tragedy she could do little to change. She recalled going back and forth between the Tapas bar and the apartments, unsure where she was most needed. At times, she joined the crowd. At times, she lingered on the veranda of apartment 5A, watching as others rushed past. When asked later what she did to help in the search, Diane admitted candidly that she didn't know where to go, or even how to begin. She felt powerless. In her own words, she described feeling helpless. That honesty is striking. Many in the group later described frantic efforts, running through streets, searching the beach, knocking on doors. Diane remembered sitting in silence, overwhelmed by the chaos. Her role was not that of the searcher, but of the witness, absorbing the panic without a clear sense of how to act. Eventually, the twins, Sean and Amelie, were brought into her apartment for safety. With Kate and Jerry in turmoil, Diane became the caretaker once more, the grandmother figure watching over the children in the middle of the night. It was one of the few tangible roles she could assume as events spiraled out of control. She described the response of the Portuguese police as slow, inadequate for the urgency of the situation. In those early hours, she expected officers to lock down the resort, to control roads, to search every corner. Instead, she recalled delays, confusion, and a lack of decisive action. That impression, shared by many in the group, deepened the sense of panic and despair that marked the night. By the end of her interviews, a picture of Diane Webster began to emerge, one that was very different from the polished narratives offered by others in the group. Her testimony carried certain defining traits. Above all, she admitted forgetfulness. When she didn't remember, she said so. Where her memory was vague, she didn't try to fill the gaps with guesses or polished timelines. In a case where every minute was under scrutiny, that candor made her stand out, but that doesn't mean her testimony lacked value. On the contrary, Diane provided some of the most unique and unsettling details in the record. It was she who noticed how unusually deep the twins' sleep was on the night Madeleine disappeared, and voiced the suspicion of sedation. It was she who observed the group's rhythms without embellishment, the children napping, the comings and goings at dinner, the lateness, the absences. Her account didn't dramatize. It simply set out what she saw and what she didn't. And yet, because she admitted to vagueness, because she sometimes seemed scatterbrained, her words were often overlooked. The public image of Diane Webster became shaped not by her testimony, but by perception. She was the grandmother on the edge of the group, the helper, the wine drinker, the one who seemed forgetful, and that perception carried weight. It meant her testimony, though valuable, never commanded the attention it might have if delivered with more authority. Was Diane Webster genuinely forgetful, struggling to recall details under pressure? Or was her reticence deliberate, a strategy to avoid saying more than she needed to? In other words, was she the grandmother who couldn't remember, or the quiet observer who decided it was safer to hold back?
I think we're on video. We're still on video, don't worry. We can get everyone in. Cheer up, Jerry, we're on holiday.
As the years passed, the Madeleine McCann case became one of the most publicized missing child investigations in the world. Newspapers filled their pages with timelines, speculation, accusations. Documentaries dissected the roles of the McCanns, the Tapas 7, and the Portuguese police. But one name rarely surfaced in those retellings: Diane Webster. She wasn't accused. She wasn't spotlighted. She wasn't remembered. In the endless debates that raged across television screens and online forums, Diane faded into the background, almost as if she hadn't been there at all. But she was there. She was at the table on the night Madeleine vanished. She was in apartment 5A when Kate raised the alarm. She was the one who noticed the twins' unnaturally deep sleep. She was the grandmother who, in her own quiet way, played witness to events that would grip the world. To call her invisible is only half true. She was seen, but not looked at, heard, but not really listened to, and that forces us to ask a difficult question. Are we guilty of overlooking the quieter witnesses? In cases like this, attention gravitates to the central figures, the parents, the friends, the suspects. But what about those at the edges? The ones who don't shout for attention, who admit uncertainty, who speak plainly, and then step back. Sometimes it is those voices, small, hesitant, half forgotten, that carry truths we ignore at our peril. At the start of this documentary, we saw Kathy Bates as Matty Matlock, underestimated, dismissed as harmless, treated with sympathy, but not taken seriously. And yet, all the while, she was piecing together the truth under everyone's noses. Fiction, yes. But in Diane Webster's story, the echo is clear. She too was underestimated, overlooked, cast as the scatterbrained grandmother. And yet, she noticed things. She said things. She recorded details that slipped past others. And that was the PJ testimony of Diane Webster. What stands out is her role, quiet, often overlooked, yet always present. A grandmother invited along at the last minute, persuaded by her son-in-law, David Payne. She admits she didn't take part in night checks, didn't push herself into the group's routines, and sometimes seemed forgetful in her answers. But she also noticed things, details about the children, the dinner, the alarm that night, that things were still yet to notice. But let me ask you this. Diane Webster said David Payne persuaded her to join the holiday. Could that really have been for babysitting duty? And if so, why was she at the Tapas bar most nights instead of giving Fiona and David space while watching over her grandchildren? Was she truly comfortable leaving her toddler granddaughter alone in the apartment? Or was there something else at play, something we still don't fully understand? If you found this documentary thought-provoking, make sure to hit the like button, turn on notification, share it with others who follow the Madeleine McCann case, and subscribe for more deep dives like this one. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.